Soosology, we've signed up with Barbecue. We're going to raise some money for cancer research, and we thought we'll invite you guys along. Come along for a barbecue.
Yep.
Meet us all.
That's it.
Yep.
And as a thank you, if anyone is donating
Over 20 bucks.
20 bucks.
Yep.
We'll invite you out to the Soosology network here, and you can see how this is all done. See this area. See this great man cave.
The studio. The studio.
Gunners
the
Club.
Gunners Club on the
15th of March.
In the west of Melbourne, so sorry.
But we're worth it.
Maybe we are, but cancer's a really good cause.
That's it.
Raising money for cancer, that's a good cause. So over $20 donations will get a private invitation.
And you get a free barbecue.
And
a
you get your barbecue. But
Everyone always feels good when they donate a little bit something, and make sure it's your good deed.
And we'll have a cold one with you.
Cheers.
And once again, we're back in the Gunners Club.
And we are so glad you're with us. You're here with Gunner, of course, with Soos. I went the other day and I saw Pamela Anderson, I think, at her best. Now I know when she was younger, pinker, sweeter, more cherubic in things like Baywatch, I know for a fact she nursed some of you through puberty.
Oh, yeah. I still remember that body-hugging red swimsuit of hers.
Running in the sand and jiggling and giggling. There was less jiggling and giggling in the movie that I've recently seen, and that is The Last Showgirl. A fascinating movie, and let me tell you why. For under $2 million, they managed to make this movie.
That's nothing.
They made this movie for such a brief time, and it was only a few weeks that they were actually in Las Vegas on location, so you get the whole atmosphere, the whole spirit of what Las Vegas is today, and you can imagine what it was in the past. And the film itself is lovely and brief. It's 85 minutes.
Oh, okay.
I love films like that because I don't have to sneak out halfway, go to the toilet, and end up having to go to see the film again. Pamela Anderson has still got cheekbones, I think, that could cut glass.
Oh, okay.
Incredibly beautiful woman, and I understand that beauty changes over age. She's still a very beautiful woman. But what this film does is it shows you the intimate portrayal of a person who's donated their whole life, dedicated it, to the craft of being a showgirl. Now, back in the glory days of the very late 1950s
Yes.
and the 60s,
And 60s, yep.
being a showgirl was really it in a bit, and that's what Las Vegas was about.
Well, that was also like the pathway, if you want to call it that, a pathway to being discovered for something, I don't know, for movies. It to some extent.
It was a craft as well in itself, in that you could start off basically in the chorus line as a showgirl.
That's right.
And you would be basically one of those amongst the cast. And then you could actually rise in seniority and in your skill and basically be similar to a prima donna. You'd be one of the people who would have a more outlandish, let's say, costume.
Yeah.
Some of these costumes were works of art. We're talking about in the days of, say, Jubilee at Bali, a costume having 3,000 feathers.
What?
3,000 feathers. Now, most of these would be ostrich, and you'd have turkey feathers as well. They'd be elegantly designed. They'd be dyed. It would be a glamorous thing. If you're a showgirl, your costume could conceivably weigh up to 65 kilograms.
How the hell did they carry that?
Now,
Are you serious?
Yeah,
65
I'm serious.
kg?
Now, you can imagine if you were... We're in the Gunners Club here, so we're talking amongst some people who've served.
Yeah.
If you're a soldier and you'd had to do a forced march together with your filled water bottles and your rifle, it's nowhere near 65 kilograms that you were carrying. These showgirls, in their prime, back in the heyday, were doing up to 15 shows in a week.
Well,
and you'd expect on a
that's right.
Saturday that you'd be doing 3 shows. How extravagant were these things? Well, the Jubilee at Bali, that's probably the real zenith of the showgirl era. They had over 120 dancers in the show. We're talking back about 30, 40 years where a show would cost $10 million to design and to put the backdrops. Let's say you'd have running water and you'd have waterfalls in the background. You'd have everything that would open and shut. And back in the day, Remember the days of the Rat Pack?
Oh, very well. I wish I was back in those days.
Now, amongst the Rat Pack, I mean, you're talking about people like Frank Sinatra, Old Blue Eyes.
Yeah.
I think
Sammy Davis.
Sammy Davis, and I think an actual even better singer, Dean Martin.
Yes, very much so.
Incredible.
I actually agree with you.
Yeah. And they would be on stage and dancing with the showgirls. If you went to see a show, you'd see these people together with the showgirls. Even Elvis Presley had showgirls associated back in the day in Las Vegas. When I'm talking about back in the day, I'm talking about an early Las Vegas that was created when gambling was legalized in that area.
When the mob was in charge.
The mob was in charge, and it wasn't a bad thing if you're a showgirl. And let me tell you why. If you're a showgirl, some people had the misconception that it also meant that you were an available woman for hire. That you were effectively a call girl. That notion was never discouraged back in the day because it would attract the punters to come and to watch a show. But in fact, it wasn't what they did. These people were trained artisans. They lived, however, under the protection of the mob.
Yep.
They were paid by the mob. The industry was part of the mob. These are in the days of things like, we're talking about the Flamingo, the Sands. Some of these names are just legend in themselves. Now, we've seen in time these casinos actually demolished, returning to the dust. And the only thing that separated the desert, the veritable desert, from a place that was an oasis of culture and style and sophistication and money, was the gaming, was the drink, was the showgirls, was the shows themselves.
If you want a reasonably accurate depiction, and I'm saying a depiction, of the lifestyle of the era, have a look at that movie. I think it's still available on streaming on one of your services, your Netflix or whatever, called Casino.
That is great fun.
Isn't it?
Great
but
fun.
I mean, they had the, where him being the casino boss, De Niro, being the casino boss, and he was weighing in the showgirls. I don't know if you remember that scene.
And look, it doesn't surprise me. I remember Joe Pesci really features
Yes,
him
of
with me in
course,
the
yes.
golf scene with the tax aeroplane in the air.
Yeah.
This is not unrealistic. You see, if you're a showgirl, generally you'd have to be very beautiful.
Yes.
You'd be expected to be over 5'8", and these showgirls would be up to 6'2". On top of that, they'd be wearing heels that might put another 4 inches on them, and a headdress that might be another foot, a foot and a half in itself. So we're talking about an appearance of a goddess on stage, always leggy,
Yes.
of let's say up to 7.5 feet in height, when you included the natural height, the heels, and the headdress that they wore.
Yep.
These were works of art. Generally, they were women who were good at dancing, they were good at learning a routine, but they weren't quite up to the ballet level. But having said that, the ballet company in Las Vegas existed because of the showgirl industry.
Yep.
If you couldn't cut it out as a ballerina, it didn't mean you didn't have the talent for it. It might simply be that you were too tall, because think about this. If you were a prima donna, let's say a first lady, in the ballet company, it would mean that you would have to be petite enough for a male ballerina to be able to lift you above their head. If you were too tall, naturally leggy, the showgirls was your life. That's where
Yes.
you belonged.
Yeah.
These girls worked hard, and I mean really hard. If you
I
were
believe
dancing,
they also got paid reasonably well. The mob looked after them.
they were paid reasonably well, and it was an aspiration to be a showgirl. If you were working up to 15 shows a day, And they were
A week.
changing a week, and they were changing the show every 6 months. It was conceivable that you were working past midnight, let's say 2 o'clock in the morning, and still learning what the new show was and having to make sure you did that. Was it dangerous? If you were wearing heels and walking down a staircase,
Yeah.
it was dangerous. The costumes were wide. The costumes were elaborate. You had to have stage presence, but also stage awareness and know the girls that were close to you. That meant the movements couldn't be vigorous. They couldn't be vigorous for 2 reasons. One, your tits were out. And breasts do have a habit to
And God
move.
bless them.
They do have a habit to move, and sometimes unpredictably, and not aesthetically well. So there was great control of the upper torso as to the way that you'd move. Also because of the fact that you had the great headdress, and maybe you were wearing appendages like wings as well. The choreography was first rate. Girls dreamt of being showgirls, and in the film The Last Showgirl, we see Pamela Anderson. She's a woman of 57 years of age, and this actually happened. You had some showgirls on stage who were in their 80s.
What?
And these people were respected for the culture that they embodied and what they demonstrated in the show.
Hang on a second. You're saying to me that they had showgirls? Okay, but they weren't performing.
They were performing, but
At
they were
80.
covered up. They were discreetly. The couture was more discreet than for a 20-year-old girl.
Understandably,
realistic.
but an 80-year-old showgirl was performing. That's what you're telling me.
That's right.
Wow.
That's right.
Okay,
and it was a source of
blown
pride.
away.
It was a source of pride for an older dame who'd worked the stage to be interviewed and talk about her craft and what she did. And there's still today a lot of reunions for people who plied that craft.
Yep.
You think of Las Vegas, what's the very first thing that you think of? It's probably not actually the casinos. It's probably the signage that you see first off in
Yeah,
Las
of
Vegas,
course.
which
Yeah.
is of the showgirls. Now, you still can go to see shows today, but the history, I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about what you're going to see today and why. It's very, very interesting. The history really came from a lot of stage performances. We had the vaudeville in the mid-80s, 1880s, going up to, say, the mid-1900s. Vaudeville comes from the French voix de ville, the voice of the village. And what you'd have was a group of unrelated acts. It might be a person juggling, followed by a dancer, followed by a musician on stage.
Yep.
Then you had the great history of things like the burlesque. It's more bawdy, it's more risque, there's even more flesh that's shown, and it's a satire of high culture. Then you'd have cabaret, which came really from Germany, from things like Berlin, and you could say arguably as well to some extent from Paris, which was a lot more intimate show. You're playing a lot more with shadows and with light,
Yes.
a smaller theatre, but it also was a damning condemnation of the social structure in which people lived. Very, very different. And then you had the showgirls, the razzmatazz, and in this film, The Last Showgirl, the show is actually called the Grand Razzmatazz or something equal to that. Very different. Now, the whole industry with the mob and the showgirls was that, let's say you had the Rat Pack on stage. You had some very boozy gentlemen on stage who some nights might be under the weather because of what they imbibed.
But they were cool.
Oh, they were the epitome of cool,
Were
weren't they?
they? Yes, they were. Yeah.
I mean, we're going back to the Rat Pack in the days of that. I mean, Dean Martin, really, you cannot get cooler than Dean Martin.
No. And contrary to popular belief, he always played the part of being always half charged. You know, he always had a glass of something there.
Well, speaking of Dean Martin
Isn't that amazing?
and co, do you know who opened up the first legal major casino in Australia?
No.
It's a good question. It's one I'd keep for yourselves for parties. It was Jerry Lewis.
Is that right?
Yeah, very, very apt, very appropriate.
Wow.
So
Okay.
here we have a 57-year-old dame, Pamela Anderson, who's given 2 weeks' notice in the movie that the show is about to close. The industry was established because you wouldn't rely upon the major acts to draw people in. The showgirls was enough. It meant you could have an anonymous chorus of showgirls. They'd be of a distinct age, a distinct leg size. Even the racial quota actually was in place as to what you'd expect to see, how many African Americans you'd expect to see in a chorus of that time. Of course, it went on to evolve as did society. But you knew what you would get. They'd be on a set rate. They wouldn't ask for a set percentage of the house.
Unlike the Rat Pack.
So you know what you were getting, you knew what your costs would be, and that's the reason why you'd have some of these great big shows like Folie à Berge at the Tropicana, for example. You could afford to run these great big shows. These women loved what they did. It was their life, it was their trade, it was part of the culture of that city. So you see Pamela Anderson really devastated when she learns that that's going to be the end of what she's doing. She comes to a fork in her road where at 57 years of age, it's very difficult to audition for another show.
Yeah.
The industry has changed today, and the shows which are more popular, as you see in the film, are more things like your Cirque du Soleil.
That's right.
You know, the Siegfried show with the lions, that sort of stuff. Still a spectacle, but not the same spectacle of flesh. But the shows which are available today are on a lower scale. You still can see some showgirl shows in Vegas, but nowhere near to the same spectacle and grandeur of 128 women on stage for a $10 million production. That doesn't exist anymore. People are going more for... Remember I spoke about the cabaret as being an intimate show? But they're going for the intimate shows, but of a more skin-revealing nature.
Yeah.
And so you'd see Pamela Anderson, when she would learn of the shows which were available to audition for, they were looking for younger people who were willing to do a lot more for the dollar and not rely so much on their artistic skill. You see, the artistry which is relied on today is acrobatics and sexiness as apart from poise. A dancer in that time would be very much like a ballerina. You see, they described themselves, if you went out on the street in Vegas and you saw a woman who was 6 foot tall and she was perfectly poised, and the way that she held her shoulders and her body and her spine, you would just know that this woman belonged to that craft.
Yeah.
That's gone. I would recommend going to see the film for a couple of reasons. I think that Pamela Anderson really shows what it's like for a woman who's realising where she's at the crossroads of her life. You see really the end of that great legacy of what it has been a showgirl. But also I'm going to tell you one thing. In the latest edition of Newsweek magazine, there's an article about not blue-collar workers, people who work with their body, but white-collar workers in 2024, and how a quarter of people who have lost their jobs in 2024 were actually white-collar workers instead of blue-collar workers. You see, here we see a dancer who works with and relies on her body to make an income and is suddenly trying to realise what her future will be. Her friend was an ex-dancer and talks about maybe she could be a cocktail waitress and work essentially for tips. Nevada's a little bit different because they still have to pay the minimum wage, even if it is a tipped gig. Other states of the US are a little bit different. But we're finding that white-collar workers in America too, 1/4 of them in 2024, meeting that decision, what actually to do now that they've been out of the job, the industry's collapsed around them, and they're finding themselves in that same position. So that's a reason why I say to you, if you're interested in Las Vegas, if you're interested in the industry, if you just want to see how beautiful Pamela Anderson still is at 57, naturally a goddess, or if you actually want to understand what it is that a person should do when they're meeting those life challenges.
And for all of those in our Australian audience, and particularly Melbourne, if you hearken back to the 70s, perhaps early 80s, before the Swagman burnt down, if you remember that. Okay? We had our own version of Showgirls. It was a theatre restaurant. It was loved all over Melbourne. And there they had the Showgirls being first invited to come along to see this. I had many a pleasant evening on my own after seeing that show, I have to tell you.
Folks, if you like what you see, we're always talking about different things to do with culture, to do with economics, to do with society. Like, subscribe, visit us again.
And catch you on the next one.
We will do.
See ya.